Hello, my name is Tyler, and I'm going to be showing you how to set up Node.js and Express as a basic web server. I'm going to show you how to do this from scratch, and in order to give you the opportunity to completely replicate everything I'm doing, I'll set up a new Ubuntu machine on EC2. Now, Node is supported on Windows and Mac, so you don't actually have to use Ubuntu or Linux. It'll just be easiest to follow this screencast if you do, but many of the steps will be the same for all platforms, especially after I get Node installed. Essentially all the steps will be the same. The first thing I'm going to do is start a new EC2 instance, which is essentially just booting up a new machine with Ubuntu on it. I'm going to choose this setup, Ubuntu Server 12.04.1 LTS. It actually doesn't matter too much which exact version of Ubuntu, I just am choosing one of the latest versions. And this is supplied by Amazon, so it's pretty standard and it's straightforward for you to exactly duplicate what I'm doing. I'm not changing any of the default settings here, so the things that are here are just defaults, and I'm just clicking continue. I guess I am assuming that you have an AWS account set up and you have key pairs. If you're new to Amazon Web Services, it takes a little bit of learning to understand how to set up instances on EC2. At least I think it takes a little bit of learning. But I'm not going to cover that, sorry. It's sort of an independent topic from setting up Node. So there are actually a lot of tutorials on getting started with Amazon, so hopefully you'll be able to learn that separately, or you maybe already know it, or you're using a different machine. The only thing that matters in this instance setup is the security group, because it's basically a firewall. So the only thing I chose that's not the default is I chose a specific security group. And it doesn't matter what the name of your security group is, it just matters which ports are enabled. So let me show you my screencast security group. I have 3 ports enabled: port 22, port 80, and 9123. These are all TCP ports, and the first 2 are just the SSH and HTTP default ports, so those are pretty important. I need port 22 open because otherwise I can't get a shell on the machine from my laptop, and then I need this open so that a web browser can access it. 80 is the default port for any web pages. So yeah, I named my security group Screencast, but it doesn't matter what it's called, just the fact that these ports are enabled. Alright, so let's check out the instance I just started up. Here it is, it's this T1 micro instance, and I need to get a host name. This is a public DNS, domain name service, and now I've copied the host name so I can secure shell into there. Here's my key file, my local key file, and then my username by default in Ubuntu is Ubuntu. I pasted that host name, and now I'll log in. It's going to ask me, are you sure you want to continue connecting, because it's the first time it's seen this particular host name. And I type yes, and I'm waiting for it to log in. Now once I log in, the first thing I'm going to do is download the source of Node.js and build that. And I know from experience that there are a few packages like G++ that I need to install before I can even compile Node. So the first thing I'm going to do is sudo apt-get update, and that will, I believe what that does is it updates the basically the package sort of framework or architecture that apt-get uses to download and install packages. So basically it'll make sure it's using the most up-to-date URLs to download everything, if I understand it correctly. I'm not an expert at this stuff. I actually am sort of a newbie, but I'm a newbie who has actually set up a website with Express before, so I have enough experience to show other newbies how to get started. And the reason I'm making this video is just because I don't think there are many Express tutorials, and I think Express is cool. All right, so we've done the update, and now what I'm going to do is sudo apt-get install, and then I know that I need these packages, lib, ssl-dev, g++, and make. Before I run this, I'll tell you what's going on. Sudo is run as super user because when we're installing packages, we might need to write to directories that only root has access to. So apt-get is the package manager that comes with Ubuntu, and it basically makes it relatively easy to install things. And that's my cat in the background. So install is the command that aptitude will run, and these are the three packages that will be installed. The first one is the development package of the library for SSL, which I think stands for Secure Socket Layer, and that's essentially the tool that differentiates HTTPS from HTTP, and it encrypts traffic and avoids things like eavesdropping, so that like if you're sending a password to a server from a client, that it's harder for people to get that password. It's not quite plain text anymore. G++ is the GNU C++ compiler, and make is a tool for parsing makefiles. Makefiles, maybe you've seen this before if you've ever built anything from source, but makefiles describe dependencies between object files and linking settings, compiling settings, things like that. All right, so I hit enter. Yes, I want to continue. And now it's going to install those three tools. While it's doing that, let's go to the nodejs.org site, and I will find the URL for the source code. So copy link address. Okay, so now I have the source code URL in on the clipboard, paste bin, whatever you call it. And as soon as this is done, I'll download the source, and I'm going to run. There's kind of three commands that usually are typically run to build something, which are configure, then just make, and then sudo make install. Theoretically, I could have downloaded the binaries, but to be honest, I'm still kind of a newbie, and I actually don't know how to install the Linux binaries. I mean, it's kind of a silly thing because the building step takes forever, and installing them should theoretically be simple, but I actually just don't know how to do it. If I run sudo make install from these, from source code, it puts everything in the right place for me. So yeah, I'm slightly embarrassed that there's going to be some stuff in this screencast I don't know how to do the best way, but I know how to get everything working, and I'm pretty confident that even though I might not know the best way to do it, once it's done, it's working the way it's supposed to be. Okay, so I've installed those packages, and now I'm going to download the source, and now I'm going to extract the source. So tar x is extract, verbose, and then the file name. That's basically just unzipping the file I downloaded. So now I have a node version 0.8.9 directory. I can get rid of the tar file. Great, so now we have the source, and I will run configure, and in fact, I'm pretty sure everything's going to work, so I'm just going to run everything on one line. Configure, and then make, and then sudo make install. And in case you're new to the double ampersand notation in bash, that basically just says if the first thing succeeds, /configure, then make, and then if that also succeeds, then do sudo make install. Now this is going to take a while, so we'll take a break and we'll come back when it's done. And we're back. Okay, cool. And we are done with the build of Node. I can test this out. I can run Node. And let's print something out. Hi there. I'm going to hit Control D to exit. Okay, that worked. Cool. And then I should also have npm. Let's see. Yes. npm is the node package manager, which I'm going to use to install Express. But first, I actually would like to show you how to use just Node by itself as a web server. Node has everything you need in it. So if I make an analogy with Python or Ruby, these are languages that come with REPLs. They have a REPL is basically an interactive, sort of like a shell almost, except it's not designed to be used like Bash. It's designed to be used to interactively code. And well, it's not important that it's a REPL. What is important is that I can basically make a text file with the code in it, and then I can type node, the name of that text file, and it'll run that code. And it comes with a standard library that supports HTTP serving. So theoretically, you could write your entire web stack in straight Node, theoretically. But in practice, that's a lot of work, and so there are tools to help out, like there's something called middleware. Connect is a particular implementation of middleware that is integrated into Express, and Express has a bunch of tools that makes it easier, similar to Rails for Ruby, makes it easier to run a web server on top of Node. All right, so I'm going to make a directory called site1, and I will build a file. And in this file, this will be a Node source file. And I'll show you how to set up a basic HTTP server in direct Node. This is without Express. And the reason I'm doing this is to show you a little bit about Node. I think it's really helpful to have in your mind a clean separation of what Node is and what Express is. And if you just dove in and just learned Express directly, I think it'd be easy to not have a good understanding of the difference between Node and Express. So basically, Node is a lower level component, and Express is built on top of that. Generally, so the command I have here is sort of like an import command. If you're used to C, you might have done something that looked, something like this line include statement. If you're used to Objective-C, it would be an import. If you're used to Python, it would be an import. So now what I have is essentially this object called HTTP, which has a bunch of attributes that I can use. So one of these attributes is there's a function called createServer, and that's going to return a server object. And what I need to pass in is a function taking two parameters, request and a response. And this function is going to be called when a request is made to my server. And the response object has a few methods on it. One of them is a write head method, which I can use to write headers in the response. So I'm going to set up a status code 200 response, which is an OK response. And then I'm going to send in a string let's put it in a new line. And that string, because I'm calling it with the end function, I'm calling the response object, I'm calling response.end with a string, and that's going to complete the connection associated with this request. I mean, it might be a keep alive connection. It won't necessarily close the connection, but it'll respond completely to this request. And then I'm going to listen on a port. And in fact, you know what? Let's make this a variable, this port thing. Variable port equals 9123. The reason I'm doing that is because ports below 1024 are protected, meaning that if I tried to listen to port 80, which is the default, I would get an error unless I was running a sudo, and I don't want to run a sudo. You could run a sudo as if you want to, but I have a different way of addressing that problem, which I'll mention later in the screencast. Okay, so here's my complete server, and it will only serve one possible page, which says "Hello there, world." It's not running yet, So now it's running. It's listening on that port, and I'm going to have to go back here and grab the host name again. Now, if I went directly to that URL, it'll give me an error because it's going to try port 80. So I'm going to have to add port 9123. There's my response. And if you want to see a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes, I'm going to click on, this is developer tools. I'm going to refresh with those on, and then I can see what happened with that particular request. Here's the things that Chrome sent to, I don't know why there's a cookie there actually. I'm not going to worry about the cookie right now, but what I wanted to show you guys is the response. It says here text plain, and it gave me a code 200. Here it says status code 200, and those are the things that I controlled, essentially. Now that's not a real web page. That's just that's basically just a text file. But from here, it wouldn't be very hard to send back a real HTML page. And just to reiterate an earlier point that I made, the security group has to have the port 9123 open for that to work. That's an easy mistake to make. Okay, and I'll show you one other thing that's really useful for running this. Now, if I had logged out of my SSH there, my server would have shut down. So maybe you already know this, but I'm going to tell you just in case. What you can do is you can run your server under NoHub. And I'll put an ampersand at the end. Now those two pieces did two different things. NoHub stands for no hangup. And I think the name probably comes from maybe modem type days when you ended a connection, it was a hang up. I'm kind of speculating, but by default, when you run any kind of process from bash, an interactive login bash shell, when you exit that shell, all the processes you started receive the signal called sighup. It stands for the hangup signal, and when they receive that signal, the default behavior is to exit. So you log out of your SSH, and then your server shuts down. That's the default behavior. You don't want that to happen. So when I run the command under NoHub, it runs the same command as if NoHub wasn't there, except that when I log out, it's still running. So I guess I'll log out just to kind of show you what I mean by it's still running. So I'll just reload. Okay, it works. And I have to log back in. And then the ampersand at the end means to run in the background. So that means I can keep using the shell even though it's in the background. Oh, this is interesting. System restart required. So if you guys ever come across that, just in case you're using the same setup, this is how you do system restart, sudo reboot. I'm not going to do it right now because I'm showing you some stuff. So we've created site 1. What should I show you next? I think I'll show you how to load an HTML file from disk and serve that, because that's a useful thing to know how to do. And I'll still do this from within Node because I think it's very useful to understand Node pretty well before we get into Express. All right, so let's check out. Let's change this. We're going to use the file system. So I'm going to require the file system, and every time I get a request, I'm going to read a file. Let's read index.html, and that is going to have a callback that gives me either error or some data. Oops. Let's see. I have some specific settings that I like. I like to have I can't talk and type at the same time. Tab widths of size 2, and I use spaces instead of tabs. Personal preference there. Okay, let's see. So now I've got the data, and I'm just going to send that data right on over. And I'm going to change plain to HTML. If you're not familiar with Vim, that's also cool. You can use Emacs or whatever text editor you like. I just like Vim, but that's pretty independent of using Node. Okay. Oh, so now let me explain what I have done. I've set up this read file command. Now this is the thing with Node. The whole philosophy is to have asynchronous, basically command flow. And what that means is if I do any operation that could possibly kind of wait in any way, such as waiting for the disk to read, waiting for a disk to write, waiting for a database to server to reply, or doing some kind of server-side HTML request to another server, for example, all of these cases, my server is waiting around, and since I want to actually respond to requests as much as possible, I don't want to pause the operation of the server. So this one line right here will start the file read, and then basically my my callback will end, but there will be a scheduled callback, which is this function right here, function that takes error data. And later, when the file is read from the disk, this function is called, and that's when these two things happen. So this res object stays alive, and it's the response, and it's kind of that the connection with the client and the response are just kind of waiting around. And it's not going to be too long. I mean, it'll be a few milliseconds, maybe a couple hundred milliseconds in sort of a slow case. But the good thing is that if I have many requests coming in, then those other requests get to be responded to even while I'm waiting for disk reads. Okay, so now I have to write an index.html file. So let me put in something, let's see. Okay, so there's something slightly interesting. There's a header and a bold tag so that it's a little less boring than it used to be. Now, am I still? Okay, it's good that we got a little error here. I did that on purpose to illustrate errors. And what that means is the address is already in use. Basically, it means that I forgot to shut down my previous server, so it's a good chance to show off pgrep. Pgrep is it's basically PS shows you the processes that are running. These are just the processes that I've started within my current shell, but pgrep has access to more than that. So here's like a whole lot of processes running, including things I did not start. But pgrep gives me the process ID of anything matching this string. So it's similar to running something like this command here. And actually, there's a really convenient way to kill node, which is pkill space node. So now I've just killed my old node server, which was running site 1, and now I can go back and run site 2. Great, now it's working. Now I'm going to reload this guy, and great, you can see that it's actually loading some HTML. Technically, it's not compliant because there's no HTML tag, there's no doc type, so I'm being sort of a bad HTML coder, but you can see that it's loading from the file correctly, and I could put in correct HTML theoretically to that file. So now you understand a little bit about how the file system works, and hopefully understand that it's asynchronous file loading, which is a huge part of the philosophy of Node. Okay, next up, I'm going to actually install Express and start using Express. All right, to install Express, I can just type npm install Express. npm is the Node package manager, and it knows a lot of Node modules, and it'll install that for us. So now there's a Node modules directory that'll be created wherever you called npm install from. I don't have tree, so I can't show you that. Let's see, maybe I can do this. Okay, that's not a great visualization, but I've installed Express effectively here, and let me build a simple site that uses it. I'll call this site 3. So just like the previous sites, it's going to be a JavaScript file that I'll run in Node, and I'm going to require the Express module, and then I'll set up an app object. So Express is callable, and that second line just creates essentially a server object. What I can do from here is tell it to respond to certain routes. So the / string here says that if a client sends an HTTP request for the path, which is just the root, just the /, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a response, and I'll say hello there from Express. So this is similar to, a little bit similar to what we had before. Something that's new is this .get, and I could change that to a .post, for example, and that would respond to HTTP post requests. The default is get. I don't have to type in the status code. It's handled automatically by Express for me. So these 3 lines right here just registered a way to handle the route specified by this string. Actually, why don't I show you, I'll put in another example so you can get an idea of how I can change things. So now there's basically two URLs that I can handle, just the default URL of the domain and hi. And now I still have to listen, so I'm going to do the same thing I did before and listen on port 9123. Alright, let's run this. And I've got a lot of stuff open here. Okay, great. So it's up and running. Now if I type in /hi, you'll see that it actually says hi. I can zoom in case that's not clear. Hi there from Express. Hello. Cool. Now one of the first things you'll want to do is listen to port 80 instead of some weird port. So I'm changing the port number here, and I'm just going to show you what happens if I don't have super user permissions when I run it. It's throwing this access. It's an access error, and basically any port numbers under 1024 are protected ports, and you have to be, by default, you have to be super user to listen to those ports. So I could use sudo, and it's listening to port 80. By the way, if you're not familiar with the Ubuntu and the default AWS setup, the reason that this works without a password is essentially Ubuntu is a sudo, or basically my user has permission to run sudo without having to type in a password, essentially. That isn't always the case. Sometimes, like on your Mac, you probably have to type a password if you run sudo. Okay, so that works, but I actually don't like that solution. Let me demonstrate that it works. I'm going to get rid of the port number and the URL and the domain name and URL. So it works now. That went to port 80. But I'm going to show you a different approach, which is to use IPtables. And IPtables is a way that my server can, outside of the process running Node, can route ports from one port to another. Basically, it can redirect the request. After the request gets to the server machine on port 80, it'll essentially redirect that request to a different port number on the same machine. So I have to run this one sudo command, but when I run Node, I will be able to run Node as the Ubuntu user, which has lower permissions, and basically it's a little safer. So this command, I am not going to tell you what it's doing essentially because, well, I mean, it's doing what I just said, but I'm not going to analyze all the individual components because I don't understand what it's actually doing, to be honest. I understand the end result, but I don't know why I have to do, for example, -t NAT. I don't really know what that means, but I know the end results. So, oh, hold on, pause that. Let me edit this guy, and I'm going to change port 80 back to 9123. Okay, great. So now I'm listening to port 9123, but if this works, let me see if this works. Great, that works. And I didn't put the port number in the URL here. I can zoom in on the URL. If I did put the port number, well, actually it's still going to work because the firewall lets that through. But you know, your users are going to expect it to work on port 80. So this is a setup that essentially listens on port 80 without you having to run a super user as root. Now there are other things I can do in Express. Actually, there's a lot I can do in Express that I haven't showed you yet. The first thing I'm going to show you is how to use more sophisticated routes. So here I have /user and then /:ID, and whenever we have a word preceded by a colon, it basically treats that as kind of a regular expression where in a URL that :ID could be replaced by basically any word, and then it becomes a variable that I have access to. So imagine I'm writing Twitter, then if I go to twitter.com/username, then I can have one app.get for accessing a user's timeline if I was writing a Twitter server. Okay, so what can I write? Let me show you how to access that. Okay. Let's see. All right, so I'm just going to send back what the ID is. So what happened here is I've accessed this an attribute of the request object called params, and params is where Express parses the route parameters. So this string ID matches the substring here, ID here, and whenever I get a URL that has this path, it doesn't have to be, again, I think I've made this clear, but it doesn't actually have to be :ID. It's like a regular expression that matches a word here. So let's see that in practice. Now what I should be able to do is type in /user let's think of a female named Baberta. That's a very nice name. User Baberta. So essentially within Node I had access to that string. So that was just a quick demo of routing, and there's a little bit more control that you can have. Let me show you one other feature of Express. There are a lot of other features, but one of the most powerful sort of, I guess, features of Express is middleware. And middleware is something that was one of the popular implementations was created by Sencha Labs, and it's called Connect. And I think that Sencha Labs Connect is basically baked into Express. So there's this app.use function, and what that does is it adds basically another function to the middleware. So the way middleware works is whenever a request comes in, it goes through all the middleware. And each middleware is basically a function that receives the request and can sort of manipulate the request and the response objects and then pass on to the next function. So basically it's a series of hooks that are kind of stacked on top of each other. And generally one of your .get functions is going to be the endpoint in this stack. theoretically, you could actually not have an endpoint by accepting a third parameter into your function called next, and then if you wanted to continue the stack, you would call next. Now, I actually don't want to do that here because I do want to handle that. I'm like done with the response. As soon as I call response.send, the response is sent anyway. So that mechanic might be a little bit confusing at first. Let me demonstrate body parser, and then maybe I can say more about the middleware mechanic. Okay, I'm going to add a new URL that I'll handle, and let's change it to what's up. That's the greeting form of cat's up. Yes, that was a lame joke. Okay, so what body parser does is it parses things like URL encoded parameters, or if it's a post, it'll parse the body of the post, which is usually URL encoded things. It might be JSON encoded, and it'll give you the output of parsing it in a format that's very easy to work with. So in particular, the request object will have this query attribute. And what I'm going to do is print out that object if it exists. Okay, so this request.query exists because I'm using the body parser middleware. And that's that app.use function at the top. Okay, so what I've done here is I've created a new URL that I can handle, /what'sup, and it'll say hello from Express, and then it'll print out a JSON representation of the URL query parameters. So let me demonstrate, because I think it'll be easier to understand if I just show you. All right, so first I'm going to show you /what'sup. Great, so it's showing me an empty object here because I haven't given it any parameters, and I could say e equals MC2. It's actually MC squared, but what it's done is it has parsed this URL into a dictionary, and here is the JSON representation of that. And I could add other things. I can say like like a Google style query equals let's see, robots army. So the plus turned into a space here, for example. So that's what body parser does. And to sort of show you a little bit more about what middleware is actually doing, I guess we could define our own middleware. Let's define a function. So basically middleware, it sounds like kind of fancy, like it's some kind of like hardware or software or something, but it's just functions. So let's have my middleware, and just like your route handlers, it takes a request and a response, and you also want to have the next function available, because at the end of your middleware, most of the time you're going to want to call next, and that passes it on to the next object. So what I'm going to do here is, I guess I'll just print out the request object. Oh, I forgot to add it. All I did is define a function. I have to say, use my middleware. All right, I did not test this before this screencast, so I have no idea if this is actually going to work. I mean, I think it'll work, but let me just reload this. Look at that. It worked. So the request acted the same as before in the browser, but on the console, in other words, in the shell, I've got this huge printout of the request object. That's more than I expected, actually. Did I send more than one request? Let's see here. It's not going to tell me. I don't know why it's so much stuff. There's the socket. There's the connection. Boring. Headers. Headers are interesting. Let's see, URL. Maybe I'll just type out the URL because that's much more concise. So basically, I've almost written like kind of a little bit of a logging function. I'm going to simplify this. Let's just print out request.url. I think that's right. All right. Now, what have we got? It was asking for the fav icon. Cool. So now let's put in something that doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. You cannot get it. But even though you cannot get it, the middleware sees it. And now let me show you one other thing so you can understand maybe why calling next is important. Now I won't call next. And if I understand this correctly, my request should not be served anymore. Let me just do the root. Let's see what happens. Oh, 404. Wait, no. That's for the old one. Oh, it's pending. Right. So basically it sends a request and it expects to get something back, but it hasn't received anything yet. And here's the URL. And so the server thinks it's done because I didn't call next, so it assumes the first middleware that does not call next handled the request. Hello there, server. Let's see. Again, it says pending. This last one becomes canceled. And it says hello there, server here. So yeah, that is it. The expected behavior that I thought. I mean, the user will be confused, but us at the server side will think, haha, that user's not getting anything. That's very funny. Okay, cool. So that's an introduction to Express and middleware. There's a lot more to it. I'm going to wrap up by telling you some of the major topics that I did not cover. Probably the biggest thing that's very common is database access. And maybe in a future screencast I'll cover Mongo, because I have some experience integrating Mongo with Node and Express. Another thing that's common is to use HTTPS, and Express is pretty friendly in setting that up. Another very common thing is to use sessions and cookies. Okay, when we send stuff here, what I'm doing is I'm constructing strings and setting those strings. And I showed you a quick example of loading HTML from file, but really you want to do something that's more sophisticated. For example, if you were writing a Twitter server, you would want to have all kinds of customized content, but wrapped in repeated HTML templates. So basically, how can you kind of have saved templates where it's HTML with placeholders for the user-specific content? And there are different ways of handling that. The way that I've used is a system called Hogan, which is based on a system called Mustache. And it's essentially a template system where I have these files with placeholder tokens, and they're replaced by things at runtime. So I haven't showed you how to do that. That's a good thing to know about. There's really useful JavaScript libraries. So jQuery is super useful, but it's actually pretty client oriented. So I wouldn't really use jQuery on the server. But there's the libraries async and underscore, and those are generally useful JavaScript libraries that I think can give you cleaner code. Then another common thing you want to do is load static files. So you might have a style.css file, and instead of writing a bunch of boilerplate code that will either cache these files in memory or whatever method you want to use to serve them, basically Express has some built-in middleware that'll make that very easy to basically just serve up static files. Debugging. Okay, so debugging this stuff, there's a really cool tool called Node Inspector, and I like it. It seems to be, like, ironically slightly buggy, but I like it a lot. And there's a way to turn on verbose errors from within Express, such that if something goes wrong on the server side, in the browser you'll see a stack trace. And I mean, Node itself has some built-in debugging tools. So I'm not covering those. And of course, there's the old standby console.log for whenever something goes wrong. You can basically type in some print statements and think about the output. Great, so that completes my introduction to Node and Express. I hope that was really useful. See you guys later.